Well, there's a positive obligation on the bank to ensure that the people who are signing a loan guarantee know what they're doing. Loan guarantees are kind of unique in that someone is giving security or a guarantee and placing themselves at risk for someone else, and they receive nothing material in return. So you've got to ask yourself, why is this person doing this? Do they know what they're doing? They're risking a lot and not really getting anything back for it. So the imperative is that the bank must ensure that these people know what they're doing and that they fully understand the implications of what they're doing, and they know that their properties may be sold if another person doesn't meet their obligations.
Although the original American Indian cultures were highly diverse, they were similar in many of their traditions. Religious beliefs and rituals permeated every aspect of Indian life. Southwest tribes such as the Hopi and the Apaches had a rich and elaborate year-round sequence of ceremonials including songs, dances, and poetry. The Hopi performed dances to bring rain. The Apaches engaged in special dances and ceremonies to gain the support of the spirits before undertaking raids or going into war. The Plains tribes often sought contact with the spirits by going on a vision quest.
No, that's an important aspect. As you alluded to earlier, we've previously done work which has proven that in some situations, even people whose blood pressure is not high can benefit from blood pressure lowering therapy. So in this study, the main reason that we included patients was because of diabetes. We didn't care what their blood pressure was, whether it was high or low. And our objective was to see whether or not lowering average or below average blood pressure in diabetics was beneficial, and the results suggested that irrespective of whether your blood pressure was high or low, if you had diabetes, you benefited.
What's an article? I was asking myself this very question in the post office yesterday, standing in line waiting to sign for, as it so happens, an article. A postal article. Not the postal article. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, an article in English is a word that precedes a noun, and simply indicates specificity. This sounds quite complicated, and to be honest, it's quite complicated to say without spraying everyone within 15 feet, but the concept's quite simple. The definite article in English is the word, the, and indicates a specific thing or type. For example, the train is an hour late. By contrast, the indefinite article in English is any of the words, a, an, or, some, and the indefinite article indicates a non-specific thing. For example, would you please pass me an apple? We always precede a word with, a, if it doesn't start with a vowel sound. For example, take a hike. I'm spending a weekend at Bernie's, or there's a knight in shining armor. Similarly, we precede words with the indefinite article, an, if they do start with a vowel sound, for example, an ostrich, an enormous mess, or an occupational health and safety policy.
For some people, this proposition may seem far-fetched, but ending poverty is both morally necessary and actually feasible. All of us must play a role in making it happen. All human beings want and have a right to live in dignity, to determine our own destinies, and to be respected by other people. Despite the universality of these rights, our capacities to fulfill them vary enormously. And no dividing line is more profound in influencing the quality of our lives than the gulf between poverty and prosperity.
For a brief moment, it was the robot king of Mars. Then it shut down unexpectedly and was lost for good. Back in 1971, the Soviet lander Mars 3 scored the first soft landing on the red planet, but it operated for only about 15 seconds and then failed. Since that time, Mars 3 has been little more than a historic interplanetary paperweight, its exact resting place unknown. Now a team of amateur researchers may have located the defunct lander. Using imagery taken by NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2007, the searchers spotted an object that could be Mars 3. Nearby, they also turned up what may be the lander's descent module and heat shield, as well as an unusually bright spot that could be the parachute. All 4 items are in the expected landing area. A follow-up photo of the region acquired by the NASA orbiter in March has strengthened the case, but the researchers will keep poring over the available imagery to make sure. Unfortunately, there's no way to get a closer look, because the current robot king of Mars, the Curiosity rover, is thousands of kilometers away.
Flaming cauldrons of molten metal have long been the primary venues for steel production, but blast furnaces require a lot of coal, which means greenhouse gas pollution. In fact, worldwide, steelmaking is responsible for 5% of annual emissions. But scientists working on a way to harvest oxygen from the iron oxide in lunar soil for future moon bases realized that they happened on a better way to make steel here on Earth. The trick? Produce steel the way we make aluminum. Use electricity rather than flame. To make steel the old-fashioned way, you blast iron ore with heat and purify the resulting molten metal with oxygen. The process removes carbon from the steel but produces carbon dioxide. Making a ton of steel releases roughly 2 tons of CO2, and the world uses a lot of steel in cars, buildings, and other infrastructure. The new method involves passing a current through a molten pool of iron oxide, which drives off the originally sought-after oxygen. The byproduct is steel, and depending on the source of the electricity, the process could be nearly CO2-free, which, as far as the atmosphere is concerned, would be very cool.
Maybe this will motivate you to work out. New research supports the idea that you don't need to spend hours at the gym every day for your body to start feeling the positive effects of exercise. In fact, a single session on a stationary bike can affect your very DNA. Okay, so your actual genetic code won't morph into that of Conan the Barbarian, but exercise sets signals in motion almost instantly that determine which genes get turned on and off. These, what are called epigenetic changes, signal to the muscles to, well, tone up. The study is in the journal Cell Metabolism. Researchers recruited 14 men and women in their mid-20s who didn't usually exercise. After a short but intense spin on a bike, samples of their muscle tissues showed temporary but big changes in several types of epigenetic signals. Further tests showed that some of the same effects could be achieved with a jolt of caffeine. Alas, black coffee can't provide all the benefits of your morning workout. But if you get to the nearest coffee shop by running, you're definitely starting out on the right foot.
is Scientific American 60-Second Science. I'm Sophie Bushwick. Got a minute? Everywhere you go, the trillions of microbes in your gut go too. And that's a comforting thought, because according to a new study, a more diverse population of intestinal bacteria is linked to better health. The work is in the journal Nature. Danish researchers gathered gut microbes from almost 300 obese and non-obese adults. The intestines of roughly 1 in 4 participants contained fewer and less diverse bacteria than average, and members of this group were more likely to be obese and to suffer from gut inflammation. By looking for only a few specific bacteria, researchers could predict whether a subject fell into the low-diversity group. Certain species could even indicate whether an individual was slim or overweight, and these microbial markers might also serve as signs of future health risks, because low-diversity participants who were obese were more likely to gain additional weight over time. But a low-diversity gut won't necessarily doom your health. According to another study in the same journal, it's possible to increase microbial diversity by developing a decent diet. Remember, you're eating for trillions. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American 60-Second Science, I'm Sophie Bushwick.
Although the original American Indian cultures were highly diverse, they were similar in many of their traditions. Religious beliefs and rituals permeated every aspect of Indian life. Southwest tribes such as the Hopi and the Apaches had a rich and elaborate year-round sequence of ceremonials including songs, dances, and poetry. The Hopi performed dances to bring rain. The Apaches engaged in special dances and ceremonies to gain the support of the spirits before undertaking raids or going into war. The Plains tribes often sought contact with the spirits by going on a vision quest.
Archery, the practice or art of shooting with a bow and arrow, has played an important part in English history, being the main weapon of the foot soldier and instrumental in winning many battles in wars with the French, with whom we seem to be constantly at war during the Middle Ages. The English favoured the long bow over the short bow and the crossbow, the latter being the main firearm of militaries on the European continent. The crossbow fired a metal bolt released by a trigger, rather like a gun, and had the longest range of any of the bows. But the main advantage of the longbow was its accuracy. The importance placed on archery is illustrated by the fact that medieval kings in England encouraged the practice, and one of them, Edward III, went so far as to ban all sports on Sundays and holidays except archery. Because there were no standing armies in those days, and in the event of war rulers had to call on the populace, everything was done to make sure there were large numbers of competent, if not expert, archers to recruit.
When societies were still mostly rural and agricultural, waste disposal was hardly an issue, partly because people tended to make use of everything, and partly because there was plenty of space to bury rubbish. It was when societies became predominantly urban and industrial that problems arose, mainly to do with health. City authorities had a hard time trying to find efficient ways of getting rid of all the rubbish. One of these was to get people to sort out their rubbish into different types, just as these days we are encouraged to separate our rubbish into different categories for easier removal and recycling. So, for example, kitchen rubbish was set aside and used for feeding animals. However, fears of disease put an end to that. In fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that all waste was simply thrown together and ploughed into landfills. Leisure travel was, in a sense, a British invention. This was mainly due to economic and social factors. Britain was the first country to become fully industrialised, and industrial society offered growing numbers of people time for leisure. This, coupled with improvements in transport, especially the railways, meant that large numbers of people could get to holiday resorts in a very short time. Modern mass tourism, of a sort we can easily recognise today, began in 1841, when Thomas Cook organised the first package tour, in which everything was included in the cost: travel, hotel and entertainment. To cater for the large numbers of new holidaymakers, holiday camps were established, both on the coast and in the countryside, and they became immensely popular. Their popularity declined, however, with the rise of cheap overseas tours, which gave many people their first opportunity to travel abroad.
No news is good news may be true for most of us most of the time. After all, we don't look forward to unpleasant things happening to us. But bad news is good news is true for those who work in the news media, and I suspect for the rest of us at least some of the time. It is tied up with stories and our seemingly insatiable need for stories. Have you ever been gripped by a story where nothing goes wrong for the characters? There's an incident in a Kingsley Amis novel that nicely illustrates this. The main character, Jake, comes home to find his wife chatting to a friend about a hairdresser both women know, who has moved with his family to somewhere in Africa. Jake listens in, expecting tales of cannibalism and such like. But no. The friend has just received a letter saying they love the place and are settling in nicely. Jake leaves the room in disgust. We demand to be entertained, and while we don't object to a happy ending, the characters have to have experienced loss, pain and hardship in one form or another along the way to have deserved it.
Classified advertisements placed by individuals in newspapers and magazines are not covered by the Advertising Standards Authority's Code of Practice. If you happen to buy goods that have been wrongly described in such an advertisement and have lost money as a result, the only thing you can do is bring a case against the person who placed the advertisement for misrepresentation or for breach of contract. In this case, you would use the small claims procedure, which is a relatively cheap way to sue for the recovery of a debt. If you want to pursue a claim, you should take into account whether the person you are suing will be able to pay damages, should any be awarded. Dishonest traders are aware of this and often pose as private sellers to exploit the legal loopholes that exist. That is, they may claim they are not in a position to pay damages.
In the 19th century, few people could afford to travel abroad. It was expensive, and there weren't the mass transport systems that we have today. So curiosity about foreign lands had to be satisfied through books and drawings. With the advent of photography, a whole new dimension of reality became available. Publishers were not slow to realize that here was a large new market of people hungry for travel photography, and they soon had photographers out shooting the best-known European cities, as well as more exotic places further away. People bought the pictures by the millions, and magic lantern shows were presented in schools and lecture halls. Most popular of all, however, was the stereoscopic picture, which presented three-dimensional views and was considered a marvel of Victorian technology.
Stem cells are the body's master cells, the raw material from which we are built. Unlike normal body cells, they can reproduce an indefinite number of times and, when manipulated in the right way, can turn themselves into any type of cell in the body. The most versatile stem cells are those found in the embryo at just a few days old. This ball of a few dozen stem cells eventually goes on to form everything that makes up a person. In 1998, James Thomson announced that he had isolated human embryonic stem cells in the laboratory. At last, these powerful cells were within the grasp of scientists to experiment with, understand, and develop into fixes for the things that go wrong.
To a female orb web spider, a suitable male can look like a mate and a meal. For these spiders, the dating game has turned into a deadly dance of evolutionary one-upsmanship. The female spider can choose when to cut off intimate relations by eating her partner or kicking him out. This dynamic has led males to an unlikely strategy to make sure they have some say in the matter: self-castration. Males are able to leave part or all of their organ inside of a female, which decreases the odds the female will be able to mate again. But new research shows that when a male leaves his whole kit and caboodle behind, his likelihood of fathering the next batch of eggs is much higher. Why? His parting gift keeps on giving, even after he is gone. This remote copulation technique actually boosts the amount and speed of sperm transferred to the female. The behavior is described in the journal Biology Letters. So, for these unlucky fellas, it is better to have loved and lost.
Pharmaceutical companies sometimes have to pull new drugs off the market because they harm our livers. The drugs may have been tested on liver cells from rats or on human cells that are nearly dead, but these kinds of tests do a poor job of mimicking real livers. Now researchers at MIT have developed a better method. They've created a colony of human liver cells that act like the real thing. The research was published in the journal Nature Biotechnology. The cell colonies are only 500 millionths of a meter in diameter. Researchers arrange the cells on a plate in much the same way as copper wires are placed on computer chips. These microlivers mimic the actions of real livers, including producing enzymes necessary to break down drugs and other toxins. The tiny organs last for 6 weeks, so they can evaluate the effects of drugs over a longer time period than current tests. A startup company has licensed the technology and is preparing it for market. The little livers could be cheaper and more accurate than drug tests now used. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Cynthia Graber.
Iron is a great material for making tools, but the oldest known iron artifacts were actually intended for decoration, 9 Egyptian beads that date back to 3200 BC. And now we know that this ancient jewelry has an even more impressive origin. The iron out of which it was crafted came from space. The metal cylinders were discovered in Egypt in 1911. To analyze the structure and chemical composition of the beads, researchers bombarded them with neutrons and gamma rays. The tests revealed that the jewelry contained trace elements not present in earthly ores, but that are found in iron-rich meteorites. The study is in the Journal of Archaeological Science. The meteoric metal was hammered flat and rolled into beads more than 5,000 years ago. This date is some 1,500 years before the invention of smelting. That technique made it possible for terrestrial iron to be shaped into tools, and to supplant copper and bronze as civilization's metal of choice. The new finding shows that long before smelting revolutionized tool use, some humans were already iron men. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Sophie Bushwick.
There are hot peppers like the jalapeno, and then there are incendiary peppers like the legendary habanero. Now there's a new variety of thermonuclear habanero known as the tiger paw NR habanero. The name comes from its appearance. The bright orange pepper resembles a tiger's paw, and the NR stands for nematode resistant. The pepper was bred by U.S. Department of Agriculture scientists to be resistant to nematodes, roundworms that attack the plant's roots. The pepper was bred conventionally, not genetically engineered, and it does away with the need to use the soil fumigant methyl bromide, which is being phased out. So how hot is the tiger paw habanero? Pepper hotness is measured on something called the Scoville heat scale. A jalapeno comes in at about 5,000 on the Scoville scale. A regular habanero usually scores at least 100,000, and the tiger paw habanero tops the Scoville scale at almost 350,000. In fact, there's a legend that eating habanero peppers can have the side effect of actually making you deaf, but only so that you cannot hear your own screams. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Steve Mirsky.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Karen Hopkin. This'll just take a minute. Just when you thought you'd heard everything, scientists have found that the reason you can hear everything, including things that are very quiet, is because your ears have tiny tube-like motors that mechanically amplify sounds. You've probably heard that it's the hair cells in your ears that allow you to hear. These cells sport tufts of spiky hairs that are like little molecular mohawks. When sound waves enter the ear, these hairs vibrate, and that motion then gets translated into an electrical message that tells your brain there's something worth listening to. But the movement of those hairs isn't passive, like tall grass swaying in the breeze. The electrical signals they produce feed back on the system, causing the hairs to tilt even more. It's that so-called flexoelectric effect that boosts the audio signal and amplifies the sound. Findings published in the April 22nd issue of the journal Public Library of Science 1. The scientists behind the study also note that the length of the hairs in different species explains why animals like bats can detect such high-frequency sounds. It doesn't, however, explain why your kids can hear their cell phones vibrate 2 rooms away, yet they never seem to hear a word you say. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Karen Hopkin.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Cynthia Graber. This will just take a minute. Elephants are smart social animals, and now we know that they can organize themselves into teams to accomplish tasks. A research team that included renowned primatologist Frans de Waal taught 12 Thai elephants, who already work with human trainers called mahouts, to get a bowl of food by pulling a rope attached to an out-of-reach table. Then the scientists threaded the rope so that it would take 2 elephants pulling both ends at the same time to move the table. If one yanked an end without its helpmate doing so, no reward. The pachyderms were paired up. Only if they pulled together could they get the food. The elephants tried the task when they were released simultaneously or at staggered times. Even when the release was staggered, an elephant quickly learned that it had to wait for its partner to come and cooperate to get the food. This finding was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Elephants are thus on par with apes for fast learning of deliberate cooperation with a partner. When grouped, individuals also remembered which of the others was their task partner, because an elephant never forgets who helped it rope a meal. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American 60-Second Science, I'm Cynthia Graber.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Christopher Intagliata. Got a minute? You've probably heard of peanut or shellfish allergies, but a meat allergy? Not as common. Even weirder is what might be causing it: tick bites, according to a study in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. A few years back, folks started showing up in emergency rooms in the southeast U.S. with hives, swelling, or worse, anaphylaxis, after eating red meat. For this study, researchers looked at 3 of those cases, and they found that tick bites, specifically those of the Lone Star tick, seemed to be the cause. The bitten victim's immune system appears to become sensitized to a substance called alpha-gal. And whereas all the major food allergies are triggered by proteins, the culprit here, alpha-gal, is a carbohydrate. Alpha-gal is found in the meat and fat of hoofed mammals, like cows, sheep, or pigs. So eating a burger can expose you to alpha-gal, which activates antibodies and leads to the release of histamines. Researchers say something similar to alpha-gal in the tick's saliva may set off the immune system, which then goes after the alpha-gal in meat, and leaves a steak lover ticked off. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Christopher Intagliata.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Karen Hopkin. This will just take a minute. When crested pigeons spot a predator, they give a little whistle. But the sound doesn't come from their beaks. And according to a study published by the Royal Society, that whistle warns the rest of the flock to flee. There's safety in numbers, and a flock offers protection in part because it has so many eyes watching for danger. But it's not clear how an individual sounds the alarm when it spots a predator. Maybe anytime 1 or 2 birds fly off, they all do, just in case. Of course, that kind of knee-jerk reaction could produce a lot of false alarms. So how can birds tell when their flock mates are seriously headed for the hills? Scientists recorded the sounds made by the wings of crested pigeons during a routine liftoff, and the noise their wings make during an emergency takeoff. And they found that the sound made by wings flapped in terror includes a distinctive sort of whistle. That noise alone will scatter a flock of feeding pigeons just as quick as the shadow of a passing hawk, and gives a whole new meaning to the expression, on a wing and a prayer. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Karen Hopkin.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Cynthia Graber. This'll just take a minute. There's a Native American site in Ohio that appeared to be a fort, but recent discoveries by archaeologists at the University of Cincinnati show that's not the case. Instead, it's a 2,000-year-old Shawnee water management system. It stretches out almost 6 kilometers. That's much larger than what had been thought to comprise the so-called fort. It's one of the largest such sites in the country. What had been thought to be gates for military protection are actually a series of dams and irrigation canals. There are logs and clay bricks for damming. Raceways for flowing water originate in far-off springs. The water was stored and channeled for irrigation. Drill cores show water sediments and clay. The site demonstrates a sophisticated knowledge of engineering, which archaeologists did not realize that Native American communities might have. The site also reveals an emphasis on public works rather than on war, so this discovery might rewrite a bit of history. Another interesting note, Shawnee remains from the time are typically of petite, graceful men and robust, muscular women. So it was probably the women who built the water system, which means even more history to rewrite. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Cynthia Graber.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Sophie Bushwick. Got a minute? Elephants don't need cell phones to hold long-distance conversations. Their deep calls can travel miles. And although humans can't always hear these vocalizations because of their low frequency, elephants produce them using the same mechanism that lets humans speak and sing. That finding is in the journal Science. Until now, scientists did not know whether the elephant made sound the way we speak or differently, such as the way cats purr. A human produces noises because the vocal cords vibrate automatically when air flows past, but a cat must actively squeeze the muscles of its larynx to produce its deep, rhythmic purr. When a zoo elephant died of natural causes, researchers took the animal's larynx to their lab and ran air through it to find out which method elephants use to make sound. They could reproduce the large mammal's low-frequency rumble, which means that an elephant doesn't need to actively control its larynx like a cat does. For those who contend that this is irrelevant...
Irrelevant? There's a whole lot of relevance in the circus.
Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Sophie Bushwick.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Karen Hopkin. This'll just take a minute. Everyone makes mistakes, especially when it comes to entering numbers into a calculator or spreadsheet. It's not such a big deal if you're tracking how much you spend on pizza, but if you're administering drugs in a hospital, such a slip can be deadly. Now a report in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface shows how devices can be programmed to catch at least some mistakes on the spot. Dosing a patient with 10 times too much medication is disturbingly common. One study suggests this error occurs in 1% of all hospital admissions. And though the person punching in the numbers is at fault, most drug delivery devices don't help. In one machine, for example, mistakenly entering a number with 2 decimal points, like 1.2.3, might be read by the machine as 1.23 or as 123. To prevent such wild guessing, scientists tested a system that immediately flags any input that's not a real number. According to their analysis, that safeguard alone could cut factor of 10 errors in half. Charles Darwin once noted that to kill an error is as good a service as establishing a new truth or fact. Even more so when killing the error keeps you from killing a patient. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Karen Hopkin.